Welcome everyone to Have History Will Travel. I am your host, the Wilder Historian, and today I will be highlighting Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Fremantle's opinions of the first and second day at Gettysburg. Fremantle was one of the European observers who were sent to the United States and the Confederacy to bring back information on the war. Stay tuned for the next video depicting the third day at Gettysburg. July 1st, Wednesday. We did not leave our camp till noon, as nearly all General Hill's corps had passed our quarters on its march toward Gettysburg. One division of Ewell's also had to join in a little beyond Greenwood, and Longstreet's corps had to bring up the rear. During the morning I made the acquaintance of Colonel Walton, who used to command the well-known Washington Artillery, but he is now Chief of Artillery to Longstreet's Corps d'Armée. Soon after starting, we got into a pass in the South Mountain, a continuation, I believe, of the Blue Ridge Range, which is broken by the Potomac at Harper's Ferry. The scenery through the pass is very fine. The first troops, alongside of whom we rode, belonged to Johnson's division of Ewell's Corps. Among them I saw for the first time the celebrated Stonewall Brigade, formerly commanded by Jackson. In appearance the men differed little from other Confederate soldiers, except perhaps that the brigade contains more elderly men and fewer boys. All, except I think one regiment, are Virginians. As they have nearly always been on detached duty, few of them knew General Longstreet, except by reputation. Numbers of them asked me whether the general in front was Longstreet, and when I answered in the affirmative, many would run on 100 yards in order to take a look at him. This I take to be an immense compliment from any soldier on a long march. At 2 p.m. firing became distinctly audible in our front, but although it increased as we progressed, it did not seem to be very heavy. A spy who was with us insisted upon there being a pretty tidy bunch of bluebellies in or near Gettysburg, and he declared that he was in their society 3 days ago. After passing Johnson's division, we came up to a Florida brigade, which is now in Hill's Corps, but as it had formerly served under Longstreet, the men knew him well. Some of them, after the general had passed, called out to their comrades, "Look out for work now, boys, for here's the old bulldog again." At 3 p.m. we began to meet wounded men coming to the rear, and the number of these soon increased most rapidly, some hobbling along, others on stretchers carried by the ambulance corps, and others in ambulance wagons. Many of the latter were stripped nearly naked and displayed very bad wounds. The spectacle, so revolting to a person unaccustomed to such sights, produced no impression whatever upon the advancing troops, who certainly go under fire with the most perfect nonchalance. They show no enthusiasm or excitement, but the most complete indifference. This is the effect of 2 years of almost uninterrupted fighting. We now began to meet Yankee prisoners coming to the rear in considerable numbers. Many of them were wounded, but they seemed already to be on excellent terms with their captors, with whom they had commenced swapping canteens, tobacco, etc. Among them was a Pennsylvania colonel, a miserable object from a wound in his face. In answer to a question I heard one of them remark with a laugh, "We're pretty nigh whipped already." We next came to a Confederate soldier carrying a Yankee color, belonging, I think, to a Pennsylvania regiment, which he told us he had just captured. At 4:30 p.m. we came in sight of Gettysburg and joined General Lee and General Hill, who were on top of one of the ridges which formed the peculiar feature of the country around Gettysburg. We could see the enemy retreating up one of the opposite ridges, pursued by the Confederates with loud yells. The position into which the enemy had been driven was evidently a strong one. His right appeared to rest on a cemetery, on top of a high ridge to the right of Gettysburg. General Hill now came up and told me he had been very unwell all day, and in fact he looks very delicate. He said he had 2 of his divisions engaged, and had driven the enemy 4 miles into his present position, capturing a great many prisoners, some cannon and some colors. He said, however, that the Yankees had fought with a determination unusual to them. He pointed out a railway cutting, in which they had made a good stand, also a field in the center of which he had seen a man plant the regimental color, round which the regiment had fought for some time with much obstinacy, and when at last it was obliged to retreat, the color-bearer retired last of all, turning round every now and then to shake his fist at the advancing rebels. General Hill said he felt quite sorry when he saw this gallant Yankee meet his doom. General Ewell had come up at 3:30 on the enemy's right with part of his corps and completed his discomfiture. General Reynolds, one of the best Yankee generals, was reportedly killed. Whilst we were talking, a message arrived for General Ewell, requesting Hill to press the enemy in front while he performed the same operation on his right. The pressure was accordingly applied in a mild degree, but the enemy were too strongly posted, and it was too late in the evening for a regular attack. The town of Gettysburg was now occupied by Ewell and was full of Yankee dead and wounded. I climbed up a tree in the most commanding place I could find and could form a pretty good general idea of the enemy's position. Although the tops of the ridges being covered with pine woods, it was very difficult to see anything of the troops concealed in them. The firing ceased about dark, at which time I rode back with General Longstreet and his staff to his headquarters at Cashtown, a little village 8 miles from Gettysburg. At that time, troops were pouring along the road and were being marched towards the position they are to occupy tomorrow. In the fight today, nearly 6,000 prisoners had been taken and 10 guns. About 20,000 men must have been on the field on the Confederate side. The enemy had 2 corps engaged. All the prisoners belonged, I think, to the 1st and 11th Corps. This day's work is called a brisk little scurry, and all anticipated a big battle tomorrow. I observed that the artillerymen in charge of the horses dig themselves little holes like graves, throwing up the earth at the upper end. They ensconce themselves in these holes when under fire. At supper this evening, General Longstreet spoke of the enemy's position as being very formidable. He also said that they would doubtless entrench themselves strongly during the night. The staff officers spoke of the battle as a certainty, and the universal feeling in the army was one of profound contempt for an enemy whom they have beaten so constantly and under so many disadvantages. 2nd July, Thursday. Colonel Sorrell, the Austrian, and I arrived at 5 a.m. at the same commanding position we were on yesterday, and I climbed up a tree in company with Captain Schriebert of the Prussian Army. Just below us were seated Generals Lee, Hill, Longstreet, and Hood in consultation, the 2 latter assisting their deliberations by the truly American custom of whittling sticks. General Heath was also present. He was wounded in the head yesterday, and although not allowed to command his brigade, he insisted upon coming to the field. At 7 a.m. I rode over part of the ground with General Longstreet and saw him disposing McLaws' division for today's fight. The enemy occupied a series of high ridges, the tops of which were covered with trees, but the intervening valleys between the ridges and ours were mostly open and partly under cultivation. The cemetery was on their right, and their left appeared to rest upon a rocky hill. The enemy's force, which were now supposed to be comprised nearly of the entire Army of the Potomac, were concentrated into a space apparently not more than a couple miles in length. The Confederates enclosed them in a sort of semicircle, and the extreme extent of our position must have been from 5 to 6 miles at least. Ewell was on our left, his headquarters in a church with a high cupola at Gettysburg, Hill in the center, and Longstreet on the right. Our ridges were also covered with pine woods at the tops and generally on the rear slopes. The artillery of both sides confronted each other on the edges of these belts of trees, the troops being completely hidden. The enemy was evidently entrenched, but the Southerners had not broken ground at all. A dead silence reigned until 4:45 p.m., and no one could have imagined that such masses of men and such a powerful artillery were about to commence the work of destruction at that hour. Only 2 divisions of Longstreet were present today, McLaws and Hood's, Pickett being still in the rear. As the whole morning was evidently to be occupied in disposing the troops for the attack, I rode to the extreme right with Colonel Manning and Major Walton, where we ate quantities of cherries and got a feed of corn for our horses. He also bathed in a stream, but not without some trepidation on my part, for we were almost beyond the lines and were exposed to the enemy's cavalry. At 1 p.m. I met a quantity of Yankee prisoners who had been picked up straggling. They told me they belonged to Sickles' Corps, the 3rd, I think, and had arrived from Emmitsburg during the night. About this time, skirmishing began along the part of the line, but not heavily. At 2 p.m., General Longstreet advised me, if I wished, to have a good view of the battle to return to my tree of yesterday. I did so and remained there during the rest of the afternoon, but until 4:45 p.m., all was profoundly still, and we began to doubt whether a fight was coming off today at all. At that time, however, Longstreet suddenly commenced a heavy cannonade on the right. Ewell immediately took it up on the left. The enemy replied with at least equal fury, and in a few moments the firing along the whole line was as heavy as it is possible to conceive. A dense smoke arose for 6 miles. There was little wind to drive it away, and the air seemed full of shells, each of which appeared to have a different style of going, and to make a different noise from the others. The ordnance on both sides is of a very varied description. Every now and then a caisson would blow up. If a Federal one, a Confederate shell would immediately follow. The Southern troops, then charging or to express their delight, always yell in a manner peculiar to themselves. The Yankee cheer is much more like ours, but the Confederate officers declare that the rebel yell has a particular merit and always produces a salutary and useful effect upon their adversaries. A corps is sometimes spoken of as a good yelling regiment. So soon as the firing began, General Lee joined Hill, just below our tree, and he remained there nearly all the time, looking through his field glass, sometimes talking to Hill and sometimes Colonel Long on his staff, but generally he sat quiet, alone on the stump of a tree. What I remarked especially was that during the whole time the firing continued, he only sent one message, and only received one report. It is evidently his system to arrange the plan thoroughly with the three corps commanders, and then leave to them the duty of modifying and carrying it out to the best of their abilities. When the cannonade was at its height, a Confederate band of music between the cemetery and ourselves began to play polkas and waltzes, which sounded very curious, accompanied by the hissing and bursting of shells. At 5:45 all became comparatively quiet on our left and in the cemetery, but volleys of musketry on the right told us that Longstreet's infantry were advancing, and the onward progress of the smoke showed that he was progressing favorably. But about 6:30 there seemed to be a check and even a slight retrograde movement. Soon after 7, General Lee got a report by signal from Longstreet to say we are doing well. A little before dark, the firing dropped off in every direction and soon ceased altogether. We then received intelligence that Longstreet had carried everything before him for some time, capturing several batteries and driving the enemy from their positions. But when Hill's Florida Brigade and some other troops gave way, he was forced to abandon a small portion of the ground he had won, together with all the captured guns except for 3. His troops, however, bivouacked during the night on the ground occupied by the enemy this morning. Everyone deplores that Longstreet will expose himself in such a reckless manner. Today he led a Georgia regiment in a charge against a battery, hat in hand, and in front of everybody. General Barksdale was killed and Sims mortally wounded, but the most serious loss was that of General Hood, who was badly wounded in the arm early in the day. I heard that his Texans are in despair. I rode back to the general's camp, which had been moved to within a mile of the scene of action. Longstreet, however, with most of his staff bivouacked on the field. Major Fairfax arrived at about 10 p.m. in a very bad humor. He had under his charge about 1,000 to 1,500 Yankee prisoners who had been taken today, among them a general, whom I heard one of his men accusing of having been drunk, that he had turned his guns upon his own men. But, on the other hand, the accuser was such a thundering blackguard, and proposed taking such a variety of oaths in order to escape from the U.S. Army, that he is not worthy of much credit. A large train of horses and mules and etc. arrived today, sent in by General Stuart, and captured, it is understood, by his cavalry, which had penetrated to within 6 miles of Washington.